I have certainly never eaten a meal sitting next to a Nobel laureate, and thus you will appreciate how honored and truly daunted I am to introduce to you the 1993 co-winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Dr. Douglas North. Dr. North has been West Coast-centered for much of his professional life. His Ph.D. came from the University of California at Berkeley, and he had a 33-year association with the Department of Economics at the University of Washington, where he had a long stint as the chairman of the department. He's presently in St. Louis at Washington University, where he started and created the Center of Political Economics and also chaired that unit for many years. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he has lectured and consulted all over the world and then given advice to many groups, including the World Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Reed College. Today, as I mentioned, his visit is co-sponsored by Lewis and Clark. Although his economic research interests have ranged widely, they have largely centered on economic history. His contributions to an understanding of how personal individual choices play a role in developing institutional changes and subsequently direct the way economies evolve through time helped win him the Nobel Prize, along with his many other studies. I was lucky to have a little biography that Dr. North had written available to me, and from that I'm going to read you a short paragraph in which he explains why he became an economist, what his goal was in becoming an economist. And this is something that he decided to do after he came out of the Merchant Marine in World War II. And he says, "I went back to graduate school with the clear intention that what I wanted to do with my life was to improve societies. And the way to do that was to find out what made economies work the way they did or fail to work. I believed that once we had an understanding of what determined the performance of economies through time, we could then improve their performance. I have never lost sight of that objective." Dr. North continues to write vigorously, 8 books at last count, jillions of articles, I wouldn't begin to count them. He travels and lectures constantly and continues to win awards, the last one from the Department of Economics in Prague. But he also summers in northern Michigan with his wife, and he has a long-standing history of photography and music, which he pursues to this day. I was particularly reassured to learn that he has always taken seriously good food and wine. In fact, that was one of the requisites of the meeting today. But I was most comforted to learn that this completely impressive man maintained a C average at the University of California, Berkeley, as an undergraduate, but then he did do this carrying a triple major in political science, philosophy, and economics. In short, I am fully humbled and greatly privileged to introduce to you Dr. Douglas C. North, who will speak with us about the privatization of Europe. Dr. North.
Thank you very much, Dr. Storrs. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a Northwesterner, and so I feel like I'm back home again here in Portland, even if it's a little south of Seattle. Talking about privatization in Eastern Europe is talking about an experiment that has been going on for the last 7 years. An experiment that is somewhat successful, but in good part a failure. And so what I want to do is, one, give you some history of that experiment, and then say why so much of it has turned out to be a failure. Let me begin by going back to 1990, when the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and remember at that time it was still the Soviet Union, invited me to come to Moscow to advise them on restructuring the Soviet economy. When I got there, they were just putting the finishing touches on a plan that came to be known as the Chatelain Plan, or the 500-day plan. That plan had as its objective, and indeed the wildly optimistic view, that in 500 days you could take the Soviet Union and transform it into a market economy and a democracy, and that over that 500-day period you'd completely overhaul the economy and the polity, and then you'd emerge with a thriving, growing, prosperous economy. And indeed, it had as parts of the specifics of the Chatelain Plan the view that by day 400, you would have almost all of the assets of the economy in private hands. You'd have developed a legal system. You'd have developed a representative government. You would have created a central bank that controlled the money supply effectively. And gross national product, which would have fallen for the first 350 days, would now be rising. Well, you know, how naive could you be? This was a world in which we didn't have any comprehension of what we, and I'm talking of we now as economists, were getting into. And so let's step back a minute and see, you know, just what was the matter. Well, the beginning of what was the matter was that economists didn't have any tools to deal with this subject. Economics, as it's grown up in the United States and in the Western world, is particularly a child of a set of products in which you'd already created economies that worked pretty well, which were growing, which already had stable governments, private property, the rule of law, ways to effectively enforce contracts at relatively low cost. And so economics, as it's grown up, is all about, given all those things, how you allocate, and I'll use the definition we use in economics, how you allocate scarce resources to unlimited wants. And you do that by playing around at the margin with things, making the prices adjust effectively, making markets a little more competitive and things like that. You play around delicately with the issues. Now, we didn't have anything to say about how you get those things, how you create them. And so when along came 1990 and you had an economy that was trying to transform itself from what is laughingly, because it never worked, called a command economy, to what we talk about as a market economy, we didn't have any guidelines. What's more, all of economics is static. It's about how an economy works at an instant of time. And indeed, when we want to talk about dynamics, not only do we not have any theory, but what we do usually when we talk about it is we say, well, this is what the economy looked like in time t, and this is what the economy looked like in time t plus 1, and then we wonder how it got from 1 to A to B, but we don't know, and we make some guesses. But we had no theory. Now, that turned out to be a devastating shortcut, and a shortcoming so fundamental because we still don't have such a theory. We still don't have anything that gives us an understanding of the process by which societies, economies, and polities, and note I'm not just talking about economics, because you can't change just an economy. And in fact, one of the first lessons you learn after you get your hands dirty in this, and my hands have gotten very dirty in the last 7 years, is that it's the polity that's much more important than the economy. We know the kind of things that make economies be very productive. That is, we know a lot about productivity theory, and that's what economic growth is all about. We know that productivity theory comes from either increasing the amount of inputs of factors of production like capital, land, and labor, or making those factors of production more efficient, which we call total factor productivity in the jargon of economists. And we know a lot about what that takes. It takes investment in human beings, human capital. It takes investment in physical capital, and it takes developing new technologies, R&D, and all the standard things. There's nothing surprising about all that. I suspect any good business person who understands what he or she has been involved in long understood the kind of things that make a firm successful. And that's true. And so we formalized that in what's called the new growth economics, which formalizes it with an elegant bunch of equations and so on, and thinks it said something quite phenomenal, which it hasn't. So there's nothing mysterious about what you see whenever you see a successful economy. Now, the second thing that's not mysterious, that is a result of the research that I and others have been involved in, we know the institutional structure that will produce that. We know, and I just laid it out, we know that you've got to have a stable political system, you've got to have secure property rights that are effectively enforced. That means you've got the rule of law, and that you have mechanisms to do all that in the system. We don't know how to get there. We don't know how you get from one to the other, and that's because the process is vastly more complex than simply saying, I'll do it. Let me show you a little bit about the process, and I want to talk about some illustrations. The process involves that the players understand what they're doing, that is, understand what you might call the reality of a political economic system, and then they construct in their minds an explanation, a theory about that reality and how to change it. Now, communism was such a classic model. The only trouble with it is it was all wrong. Not completely wrong. Marxism had some very interesting elements of it that were very insightful. But when it came to the fundamentals, it didn't work, and indeed collapsed under its own weight. So that the theories we have about a system, which stem from the way we perceive the world, if they're wrong, they're going to get us into big trouble. Then beyond the theories, then we construct an elaborate framework, an elaborate structure by which we try to structure the game to get the results we want. Now that's what really the process is about. Now, historically, all through history, we've typically gotten it wrong. Growth has been much more exceptional than stagnation, decline in human history. We have an endless story in human history of death, destruction, starvation, whole societies falling apart, economies that don't work, and indeed total civilizations falling apart. That's happened all through history, and there's no reason to expect that it's not going to continue to happen. Now, so it's not that we don't know a lot about it. We don't know how the perceptions of people and the way those perceptions have evolved historically are going to produce the context which will allow them to create the kind of rules of the game, institutions, and to put in force those things that will produce what we know makes for economic growth. Now that's the puzzle. Now in order to illustrate that puzzle, let me give you a contrast. Let me contrast what's happened in the 7 years since 1989 between Russia on the one hand and the Czech Republic on the other. Because after I was in Russia with being concerned with what happened in 1990, in 1991, 1992, and 1993, I became an advisor to, in part of my time, to Václav Klaus, who was finance minister and then became prime minister of the Czech Republic. And the difference in what happened between them illustrates a lot of the story of what I want to get at. The Czech Republic, which had what's called the Velvet Revolution, which was a way by which it got rid of Soviet soldiers and got rid of the communist regime with a lack of bloodshed, came back and had the same set of questions that we posed for that we thought of in the case of the Stalin plan for Moscow. But Václav Klaus, who still remains prime minister, first of all, was a pretty good economist, and therefore developed a program which he thought would successively produce economic growth. The first part of the program was, and this is essential everywhere, was to take the assets of the society and transfer them from public to private hands. That's what privatization is about. And in order to do that, what he thought of, which is an interesting scheme, was that he would auction them off. And so he set up a committee to devise a system to auction off the assets. And the original plan that he had was that everybody who was an adult in the Czech Republic, it was originally Czechoslovakia, but then Slovakia broke off and then became the Czech Republic, would get a voucher that would entitle them to so many points that were worth things in bidding for assets when they were put up for sale. And then he went and arranged that they'd value all the companies, and that was a very hard thing to do because the companies had been run by communist officials and nobody knew what really they were worth, even though the Czech Bud company, which makes beer, makes the best beer in the world, was worth a lot. And so they had the problem of doing this. And so the dilemma was a tough one. You were trying to somehow get people to bid for assets. Nobody knew their real value. So Václav Klaus produced a program, and then he asked me, when I was there, along with two people that were with me, to evaluate the program. And we suggested fundamental changes in the program. One, I said that I thought a most crucial part of it be conceived as fair. And what he was going to do is have private individuals bid for the assets. And I said that in a world where there's asymmetric information, to use the jargon of economists, is not going to work because insiders are going to find all the valuable assets and going to leave the people who don't have inside information with all the dregs. I said, you want to encourage private investment funds to be able to participate and have people be able to buy into those rather than directly buy the assets. The reason is they will be professionals, they'll have an interest in getting the information that's required, and therefore it'll tend to produce a level playing field, and that's crucial. A perception about fairness is a fundamental thing that you must have if you're going to have success. And so Václav Klaus changed the system and then also made it into a succession of auctions. You auctioned off, and then things that didn't sell, you revised the price of the assets, reduced them, and then auctioned them again. So they had a succession tier of sales. It has become it not only was a success, but it became a model for other countries to try to develop. The second thing was, and I had a small hand in this, was that we restructured the legal system. Now, this wasn't hard in the case of the Czech Republic, and this has a lot to do with our relative success, is because the Czech Republic before 1938 had been one of the highest income countries in Central Europe, and it had Austrian law, which had been the legal system. And so what we did is we went back, took Austrian law, updated the things to deal with modern issues since 1938. And incidentally, I was over there jointly with a law professor from my university. We jointly teach a program in law and economics over there as well as in Washington University. And we helped to revise the code, although we played, again, a relatively minor part. What, in short, we did was only possible not because of what we did, and certainly it was first thing that made it possible was Václav Klaus knew what he was doing, but the second thing, and far more important, was that Czech Republic had had a heritage of having been both a democratic society and a market economy. And even though there was, between 1938 and 1990, a long period of darkness, that heritage and those set of norms and values were still powerful in the society. So when you instituted private property again, when you instituted the rule of law again, when you instituted the control of assets by individuals and attitudes towards risk and undertaking, all of these things were relatively easy to be reabsorbed into the system. And indeed, the result has been that the Czech Republic has, to a substantial degree, been a success story. I don't mean to tell you that it's a complete success story. It has lots of problems. When I was over there last year receiving the honorary degree that your chairperson mentioned, why I spent the morning with Václav Klaus, and he said, Doug, he said, you know, what really hurts is, you know, and he didn't say it quite like this, but this is what he meant. He said, they don't seem to love me. I said, no politician deserves love. But it is interesting that he did get reelected with a substantially reduced thing. But the reason why I'm stressing this is because it's been a painful process. And while the Czech Republic has a positive growth rate now, while it seems to be doing quite well, it has enormous problems still in overcoming the 60 or 70 years in which you had such fundamental dilemmas and such fundamental changes. Now, let me review the story in the Soviet Republic and Russia. They did imitate the Czech auction system, but they imitated the Czech auction system, but without having prepared the society for the kind of changes. They even gave out vouchers to people. But what was different was that the so-called, we call them the nomenklatura, but they're the insiders. They were the people that ran the Soviet Union. They're the managers of communist firms. They're officials and party officials. And the way the auction system in fact worked did solve some of it, but most of it, guess what, turned up in the hands of the existing bureaucrats who'd been running the businesses before, turned up in the hands of party officials, all kinds of things like that. So the first failure was that you didn't manage to transform the assets from public hands broadly to the members of the society. The second thing was that while they have on the books a legal system, they have no enforcement mechanism. And indeed, the legal system is a joke. How do you enforce contracts in Moscow? Well, the easiest way is you kill your competitors if you don't like them. And if you don't do that, you have your own private mafias that see that you can enforce contracts. Now, we have mafias in the rest of the world, but I have to point out to you it's an inefficient way to enforce contracts, very inefficient. Not only is it inefficient, but of course it produces an immense variety of problems with respect to the ability to develop those things. Then there's agriculture. Now, in Czech Republic, agriculture had never been completely collectivized, and a return to private farms and so on, again, because of the heritage, was a relatively easy thing to do. In Russia, it's still, most of farms are still in some form or other of disarray from the collective farms that they were to begin with. And indeed, when I visited a collective farm one time and talked to the members of the collective, I said, well, you'd surely rather, be given up. They were talking about dividing up this collective farm into 40 acres or 60-acre parcels. It was fairly good arable land. And each person who was a member would get that. And I said, surely you're all for that. After all, private plots had been the basis of much of the agricultural output of the Soviet Union, little plots of 1 acre. But when I suggested it to people, they were very uninterested. Why? Well, now think about it a minute. Supposing you had spent all of your life on a collective farm, and all you had to do is go out and plow or harvest or whatever. And that was an end to your knowledge. And what this person said to me is, how would I sell my produce? How would I get it to market? What kind of means are there? There's no structure. There's no marketing structure. There's no transport. The transport system is a disaster. There isn't any way. And so it would mean starting from scratch to learn all of the things that in a market economy are automatic. You already have them. You don't have to know all those things. But in the Soviet Union and in the Russian Republic were things that made uncertainty, insecurity, enormous dilemmas. So you haven't had much of a drive for independent farming. And so Russian farming still is a disaster area, and indeed a critical disaster area, because as long as you do, agriculture is a very important part of the economy, and output has been stable to declining in the period since 1990. And shows no signs of development. There's nothing on the horizon that suggests they're going to work it out. But the fundamental dilemma in Russia is not that you don't have the rule of law and that therefore you have mafias that are enforcing contracts. It's not that you put back much of the assets into the hands of the nomenklatura, even though that's not very good. It's not that agriculture isn't. The fundamental dilemma is the fundamental dilemma of all polities, of all economies, and that is you don't have a polity that works. Boris Yeltsin may be the best hope of Russia, but it's a lousy hope. It's a lousy hope because you cannot get stable political systems with one man who doesn't seem to be very well running a system. You have to develop the rule of law and a stable political system. They're a country mile from it yet. Until they do, then they're not going to be able to develop an effective enforcement of contracts. They're not going to be able to develop a judicial system. They're not going to be able to develop the rule of law, all of which are things that in the Czech Republic, you notice, all sort of came back into place. Not easily, but came back into place as a part and process of the change that was going on. Now, in Russia, these are not on the horizon yet. They're not on the horizon, and the result is that I don't forecast sustained growth. Now, don't misunderstand me. They're going to grow. You have some things going for Russia which are very different than some of the other places in the world I advise, like sub-Saharan Africa, which is a basket case, or Latin America, where it is an in-between. What Russia has is enormous amounts of human capital. They have very skilled scientists, engineers, a labor force that's very skilled. They have enormous wealth of resources. All of these things should make it easy. What they don't have, which is the critical phenomenon of growth, which is why the new institutional economics that we're building today and in the work we're doing is the future of economics. They don't have the political economic organization and the norms of behavior that go with it that make for the kind of stability that we take for granted in the American society, and we shouldn't, because it's a very fragile phenomenon in the world. As you can witness any time if you want to go to sub-Saharan Africa or watch South America for a while, or indeed other parts of the world, like Yugoslavia today and whatever. It's very difficult, and we don't know how to create it. We created a stable polity in America over a period of a couple of hundred years with a heritage of British tradition giving us a foundation in colonial governments in America of assemblies and democratic government, of the rule of law, of property rights. We began with that. And that long heritage has provided a very powerful set of stable rules, what I call adaptive efficiency. That's allowed an American economy over 200 and some odd years to evolve with relative stability, with the exception of a very costly civil war. But even that's an interesting illustration, because we recovered from that civil war and managed to heal a nation and come back together in a way that was remarkable. Now, that stability is the heart of what you have to have for sustained economic expansion. You can get spurts of growth like Latin America or like other countries in the world, but creating the framework that's going to produce stable growth means a polity that has a set of rules of the game, of institutions that people can live by, and that they can have confidence that you have credible commitment on the part of the people in that system, so contracts can be enforced at low cost, all the things that underlie what's made the United States a successful economic system, and what is a hard thing, but we're gradually developing some other parts of the world today, although we're a long ways. If I had time, I'd talk about China, which is the most interesting country in the world to talk about, where they're evolving on the one hand, but they haven't solved the long-run political problems at all. But in Eastern Europe, the relative successes are the Czech Republic first, Poland probably, Hungary probably, and then they go downhill from there. You've been watching what's been happening in Bulgaria, which is a very interesting phenomenon of fundamental, just the decay of the whole civilization to a standard of living that has just dropped out of sight and now finally maybe being turned around, although they've got a long ways to go. Bulgaria, Romania, then you get to the republics of the former Soviet Union, all of which have not come very far in trying to create the conditions. We're still fumbling around trying to figure out how to do it, because, as I said, we know a lot of the pieces, and we've learned a great deal in the last 7 or 8 years. Jeff Sachs, who's been a primary Harvard economics professor, who's been an advisor in both Poland and in Russia, is interesting because he started out as a good neoclassical economist who believed that all you had to do in Eastern Europe was, and I quote directly, get the prices right, and everything would fall into place. Oh, boy, was that a dumb idea, you know. But that's what economists thought, because they thought if you eliminate wage, price, and exchange controls, then you will force the creation of the set of rules of the game or institutions that will be efficient. Well, now, it would if you held everything constant, including the political system, the hardship of people on fixed incomes, and I can go all around too, but none of those things are held constant. And indeed, the results have been that we have been learning a painful lesson that there's a lot more to the process of change than simply getting the prices right. It means our understanding this process that's going, understanding the way institutions evolve, understanding the way norms evolve in a society, understanding that history matters, that you can't do in one economy which you can do in another because the culture and values and norms in each economy are different, so you've got different degrees of constraints on the way in which you try to solve problems. And once you begin to understand that, then you can begin very slowly and very cautiously with that background to start to make the kind of changes that will produce over time economies that will work better. Thank you. I'll stay there. Okay.
Yes, sir. Makes it very difficult to ask a question when you hear such a clear exposition of what's happening, but I have one.
Thanks.
It's clear that, as you've laid it out, that in the case of Russia and maybe the other USSR republics, that what they've done is dismantled the system they've had, but they have no new system to take its place. They don't know what a market economy is or how to get there. My question, so it's also to relate to things going on in this country, is a kind of a two-pronged one. One, here we are busily in this country dismantling our social safety net. They don't have any over there. The question I have, first question is, can they possibly affect any kind of a transition if they don't create some kind of a social safety net to ease the pain of people while they're trying to do it? My second question is, what are the implications for U.S. policy if, in effect, they can't effect a transition in the former Soviet Union, Russia, and the economy continues to run downhill?
Well, easy question. Thanks a lot. Well, they do have a partial social safety net that still exists. It's not a very good one, and indeed, people who have been on fixed incomes in Russia have had enormous declines in standards of living as a result. And it's true that if one of the things that you should do, that I have tried to do in other countries, is that when you're going to transform the institutional framework, you're going to have, in the policies you pursue, you're going to have winners and losers. You don't have to worry about the winners, but you better worry about the losers. And the reason why you better worry about the losers, quite aside from humanitarian reasons, is because losers in the world can have access to the political system or to violence, and when they do, they're going to overturn the reforms you're trying to do, and rightly so. So typically where I'm an advisor, and I'm an advisor to a lot of different places around the world these days, I try to couple reforms with trying to structure either the creation of a social safety net or the enactment of rules that will minimize the cost to the losers. Because there's going to be losers, immense numbers of losers, when you try to change a whole system. And indeed, for a while, the losers are going to vastly exceed the gainers because you can't help, in the process, having income fall for a number of years. So that's a big problem. And it's one that we didn't do effectively in the Soviet Union. And indeed, if you read, I think in recent papers, I think maybe in today's paper, you have big groups in the Soviet Union or Russia today that haven't been paid for months, 5 or 6 months sometimes. Not just army, but miners and all kinds of groups. You have all kinds of disastrous problems. Now, that raises your second point, which I think is a scary one. I was asked last night what I thought of the IMF, and I had very critical comments about the IMF having been exposed to some of their ways of doing things, particularly in Latin America. But the IMF loan to Russia I approve of, and I approve it for one very simple reason. This is one country we cannot afford to let fall into chaos. They still have 10,000 missiles. A lot of them may not work, but they have enough of them that probably would work. And you cannot afford to let this country fall into chaos and those missiles fall into the hands of all kinds of diverse groups, including mafia groups in the world. So we have a big stake in seeing they don't fall into chaos, and they're in danger of it. Now, I think I'm slightly more optimistic about the turnaround in Russia than I was, but I say only slightly. I do not see sustained growth in the future. I do see that they may be near bottoming out with respect to the decline in income. But if not, we're in for big trouble. We're in for big trouble because chaos is a disaster for the one other country which possesses the missiles and the forms of destruction which can destroy our world and everybody else's world too. So I think that's a really serious problem, and one that makes it so that I'm willing to put a lot of resources into propping it up, even if I don't like the way it's being propped up most of the time. Now, I don't see a lot of people at that microphone while I was talking. I want to see at least a dozen people who are going to tell me what's wrong with what I said. Here comes one.
Good afternoon. I'm Matthias Kemeny, and I will be in Budapest tomorrow morning.
Good luck. It's a lovely city.
I've been commuting for the last 6 or 7 years. I have a question for you that perhaps we can all relate to. We here in America pay taxes voluntarily, for the most part, primarily because we have a system that promotes trust between government, business, and the people, even though probably every person in this room from time to time questions that and chaffs at it, but basically and fundamentally we comply. We have my experience in Eastern Europe is that this is not so. And my question to you is, what do you think is equitable and fair as a number, as a balance between government's needs, the people's needs, and business needs? And I'm looking, frankly, for a single, uncomplicated thought, a number.
You want an answer in somewhat less than 5 hours, I take it.
Yes, sir.
Well, it's a very good question, and indeed, you see right away when you look at Russia the dilemma, because Russian tax collection is so low that nobody who really has any moxie pays any taxes. They all evade taxes. And indeed, the tax collection is about 10% of what it's supposed to be. And now the reason why the United States and countries that are developed generally, despite how much we may complain about it, is, and you said it right, is that you've got to have some complementarity between the rules of the game, including the fiscal rules of tax collection, and people's perceptions about fairness. I go back to fairness again because it's terribly important. If people don't believe in a system and they can find ways to get around it, they're going to do so. And in all of the republics of the ex-Soviet Union, tax collection and the ability to do so is just limited. Now, this gets me to the other part of what was implicitly your question. What's the size of government that you want, and how do you get it? Well, the answer in the case of most governments is you'd like smaller governments than you got. That may even apply to the United States sometimes. But what you do want is that you want to have some close enough relationship between the tax that are collected and the social benefits that the taxes are used from, so people believe in the system. And that has two parts to it. One, that who you collect from should be perceived as fair, and second, that the investments that the government makes are perceived as broadly contributing to the society's doing. And whatever, again, we say, and we have a lot of criticism, for example, about the way in which we spend, but broadly speaking, compared to countries like the ex-republics in the Soviet Union, we have a much greater perception that the system is roughly fair and tries to produce those things. So in the short run, I think it's terribly important that in Russia, for example, you can improve the tax collection so that you can get enough revenue to run things, pay your army, for example. It's a scary phenomenon. You never pay your troops anymore. They're the ones with the weapons, and that is really a scary thing. Now, that means a lot of changes. It means that government's got to be perceived. This goes back to government. Government's got to be perceived as being fair, as providing a set of standard rules of the game that apply to everybody, and that simply is not true. The people who are getting rich in Russia today are speculators, and that, I don't mean speculators in the good sense, which we're all for as economists, but speculators in the sense of people that are ripping off the rest of the people in the society. They're enormously rich. The new rich in Russia are enormously rich, and not particularly doing it in ways that is producing wealth for the rest of the society. They don't pay much in taxes, pay maybe nothing in taxes. Well, those are kind of fundamental problems that underlie the problem about government that is the key to what I was trying to talk about. Yeah.
Yes, if I could, I'd like to talk a little bit, George Boudreau, City Club member. I'd like to talk a little bit about microeconomy in these countries in East Europe. I spent 3 years with the Academy of Sciences in Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. And the people I was associated with had their apartment paid for. They had operas that they could go to with practically costing nothing, and actually they gave free opera to people at certain nights of the month. And there were a lot of these things that we have to pay for, and they paid very little for these things. And now they're turned into a society where they have to pay for these things in under conditions where they're not really sure whether they'll be employed. At Berlin Buch, for instance, they discharged 2,000 scientists there. And so how do you convert these economies and take care of this microeconomy?
Well, it goes back to the same issue. You've got, it ultimately requires that you devise a set of rules of the game, institutions, that will do this. Now, again, contrast the Czech Republic with what happens in Russia. In the Czech Republic, why, we not only got the assets in private hands and whole new groups of individuals to run them, but we managed to do that and also put in place the other pieces that make a market economy and a political democracy work. Now, in Russia, we're not even close to that. And so what you have is a chaotic jumble, and you said it right, Dan, when you talked about the fact you wiped out the institutional structure which, however badly it ran a system. It actually mostly ran it by black markets and things like, but it did run a system, however badly. Also, it did provide a certain social safety net. It didn't matter if you worked in, most of them didn't work in Russia, but you got hospitalization, lousy hospitalization, but you got it, free education, and on and on. So you had all these things given to you. All this gets wiped out, and now we're trying to restructure it, and they've got no basis to do it. They have no background by which to perceive how to go about it. Now, that's what makes the Czech Republic, with a set of values and norms inherited from before 1938, be able to transform itself, and Russia be fumbling around. Now, if you ask me, and how do you do it, and you're all hinting at it, I know no short way to do it. I think you have a long process of incrementally building up institutions, building up confidence in the system, and I do it very differently than we've done it so far, and I don't have time certain to elaborate on it. But I do it consistent with things that I know about the way in which the heritage of the Russian society works that would, I think, work. I'll give you just one quick illustration. An economist friend of mine who's at MIT called Paul Joskow was in Moscow with the objective of attempting to get firms in Moscow to be able to deal in a market economy. And for the first few months he was there, he said in despair to me, he said, I'm getting nowhere, absolutely nowhere. We can't even communicate with each other when I talk to the managers of these firms. They don't understand the basic premises of a market economy. Which is true, and which is what Dan, I think, was indicating before. Then he said, what I did is I went back and I looked at their histories and learned about how they'd evolved over the last 15 years. He said, then I began to understand the way they perceived this world, the constraints they were under. And once I did that, then I could begin incrementally, bit by bit, to start to change their attitude, to show them where there was a difference between the way they thought about the problem and the way one would think about the market economy. He said, now, he said, I'm cautiously optimistic. Well, that's the way it's going to have to be done. The way Paul did it with respect to some firms in Moscow, we're going to have to work. It's not going to be an easy process, even if we do it right, and we haven't done it right so far. It's going to be a long process. I was asked by our representative at a public meeting right after I got the Nobel Prize in 1993. It was a big public forum we had between businessmen and representatives of the republics of the ex-Soviet Union. And Representative Gephardt, who ran it and did it with a view that businessmen in America would invest enormous amounts of money in the Soviet Republic. And so Gephardt made the mistake of asking me on the platform before all this audience and a radio audience, how long, Doug, do you think it'll take before they get their act together and have stability? And I said, oh, well, maybe 50 years. And Representative Gephardt's face turned pale, and that was the last I've heard of him ever since. Now, that may be too long, but you will note it's a long process. We don't know how to do it in the short run. Yes, I'm sorry, I took too long.
My name is Maria Teresa Petrok. I am Central and Eastern European Manager for ADEC. We manufacture dental equipment. And I developed and opened the market for my company for Central and Eastern Europe since 1989. I am very curious, as you explain, of those countries that are the winners and those that are the losers or are trying to catch up. Where do you think the Baltic republics fit in? Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. Thank you.
Well, I don't know as much about them as I should. I am certainly much more optimistic about them than I am about the rest of the Russian republics. Again, they have a somewhat different heritage and background, which I think gives them a better ability to be able to adapt to new methods and techniques. Two, they have broken away earlier, and I think have gradually made a set of transformation. Now, they have some big problems, one of which, as I'm sure you're aware, is that some of them have big minorities of Russian population, and the problems that is producing are severe. They've had some problems in the creation of efficient property rights, but I'm cautiously more optimistic about them. If I had to rate all of the ex-Soviet republics, I'd put those three at the beginning of it.
Ray Polanyi, a City Club member. Somebody touched the issue of trust before, and there was a discussion of taxes and payment of taxes and value received and so on and so forth. I think that we have some sort of a good measure around, and that's voter participation.
That's what?
Voter participation.
participation.
Voter participation. Okay. And it seems to me that almost every other country has a bigger voter participation than we do. Our last election, nationwide, it was barely over 40%, as I understand. Now, to me, that's not a very good indication of trust and confidence. And I think that in the eastern part of Europe, the voter participation is substantially higher. And in Western Europe, it's also substantially higher. So do you think that there is something in what I'm saying? Can you elaborate on it?
And that's
we don't seem to have a lot of trust.
Well, that's another question that is hard to give a short answer to. First of all, I do worry that I think that declining voter participation is reflecting a cynicism about American politics that bothers me a great deal, and that I think is a very serious problem. And indeed, it is a serious problem when the head of the President of the United States and the leader of the Republican Party both are currently being investigated for things that in another bygone era would put both of them in severe jeopardy, and I find that very, very disheartening. But you can take the voter participation, because it goes back before this, take voter participation differences around the world in another light, and in part it's also true. It's a paradoxical thing. low voter participation in America may, amongst other things, because it never pays to vote in terms of individual, the likelihood that your vote's going to count, you can take it as an interpretation of such confidence in the American system that you don't think you have to worry about it. Now, it's both, you see. It's both the fact that I think a lot of people who, in America today, who are really disheartened are not voting because they're just discouraged with the way the system's working, which I think is true, but also that historically some of that vote has reflected the fact that democracy in America is very secure. It's secure, and through most of our history, people have believed that the system works reasonably well, even in spite of all of the carping. And I think both of those things are going. But don't misunderstand, I'm concerned about what I regard today as a decline in trust, not just in the political world, but I'm particularly concerned about it in the economic world. When I talk to the CEOs of a lot of firms today, and I ask, well, where is the biggest expansion going on inside your firm today? They'll say in lawyers, in defensive litigation, and things, and accountants and so on. They won't talk about things that are making for productivity growth there. The growth in the cost of transacting in business firms is mostly a growth that is reflecting the fact that the cost of transacting in the private sector of the American economy are growing. And that reflects also a lack of trust, and a very serious one that I'm concerned with. So there is a big problem there, but it isn't quite that simple. Yes?
Sid Lezak, member. Your bleak picture begs the question of whether or not out of chaos may come the man on horseback in these countries. I think we saw a little bit of that in what we perceived as a Lebed phenomenon. I'd be interested in your views on both the dangers and effects of a return to authoritarian societies, which are not inconsistent with the culture which these people have developed.
Now, that's a very good question, and you're going to get a very lousy answer because I don't have a good answer. I get scared when I listen to Lebed talk for good reason. He's obviously a man who thinks that there's a shortcut to these things, and it may look like sort of in its benign form you're thinking of something like Singapore, which is an authoritarian regime with somebody who's running it, but who produces the other characteristics make the political economic system work reasonably well. But that's not true in the case. If you're going to have an authoritarian figure in Russia, it's not going to look like Singapore. It's going to look like Nazi Germany, and that again is very scary. I want to go back. I think the dangers in the world today of nuclear mistakes are higher than they were in the years of the Cold War. Because I think that what's going on and what's going to happen to Russia in the next 10 years, I don't know. And I think somebody like Lebed might turn out to be able to create order and produce an expanding society, but he might also turn out to look like Adolf Hitler, and that's a scary prospect.
I'm Bill Connerly, a City Club member. Following up on that question, there have been suggestions of a trade-off between economic liberalization and political liberalization, the idea that the economic liberalization works better in an authoritarian context, as in the early days of Chile and China now. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Lots of them.
Would you share them?
Well, we spend a lot. One of the favorite regressions that economists run these days is they run regressions between democracy and economic growth. What do they get? Very little relationship. Now, there's some, and depending on the way you structure the regressions, you get some positive in one way and positive in another way. And the reason is very clear is because you haven't formulated the question right. The question's a lot more subtle than that. I can conceive of the fact that if you have regimes that have strong bureaucracies and have a heritage of a set of norms and values that will make it so what they'll do is invest in things that'll make you grow, that some degree of authoritarianism in the early periods of growth can produce what they did in Taiwan and South Korea, classic cases of rapid growth, but in which you got strong bureaucracy to do, not all together, but some of the right things. But if you don't have that heritage, what do you get? You get Mobutu in Zaire, who's just a thug and a theft machine that has got one of the biggest Swiss bank accounts in the world and has destroyed what was a bad economy to begin with. And you've got lots of stories like that. So it isn't easy to figure out what this mixture is. We do not have any good theory of political economy about political economic systems and how they evolve. If we did, we'd be far ahead, and my political scientist friends, you'll notice I've shifted and put all the burden on my political scientist friends. I say, you bunch of bums aren't doing your work. You should have long since developed models that deal with this issue. Instead, all of you run around studying the U.S. Congress and things like that. And I said, I'm tired of the U.S. Congress. I want to see if you can tell me something about how a third world economy's political system works. And that we just don't know. Now, we have, and I created at Washington University, a center in political economy, and we're starting to do some very interesting work attempting to get at this, attempting to understand the interstices of what makes a polity work the way it does. And once we do that, then we can understand and start to see how we can make it work better, but we don't know anything about it yet.
John Leeper, City Club member. I appreciate your comment, sir, that we as a country and the world in large can't allow Russia to go under. My perspective, though, is I am anxious about the long-term prospects of the international community, including the United States, and our patience to cope with this, what seems like very slow incremental progress that's being made in Russia. And I just wonder if the international community's patience is going to hold out long enough for Russia and some of these others to, in effect, right themselves.
Well, don't go away. I want to ask you a question because it's not clear to me. What do you mean by the patience of the international community? What do you suggest are the alternatives that the international community
I don't
faces?
have any alternatives, sir. But as far as patience is concerned, I would think something in the range of 5 to 10 years before this patience would be worn out or lost.
Well, I don't think we have a choice. I think that as long as Russia possesses the military capability implied by the ballistic missiles that it has, we better very well try to see if we can't somehow prop the system up. We've propped it up badly so far, and that's what I said. That's why the IMF loan, I think, is a good loan, even though I don't think it does what we want. But we do have to see that the system doesn't fall into chaos. And I think that is crucial that we do that, and I hope that the international community of not only the United States but other places are going to see that we do continue to do it.
Wonderful. Well, we need to end at this point, and I want to thank Dr. North very much indeed for bringing us his observations today. In an interview that he gave a publication several years ago, he said, "I think the most important thing in the world is to have a creative, stimulating, exciting life. Find out what things excite you and pursue them all your life." We're grateful that part of his pursuit has included these wonderful economic analyses, and on behalf of all of you and the City Club members and Lewis and Clark College, I thank you for being with us today. Thank you.